Montana Territory, August 1883. The sky burned gold over the Bitterroot Mountains as the stagecoach wheels kicked dust high into the dry wind. Verena Rosewood clutched her satchel tighter, keeping it close to her chest like a shield. Her black mourning dress clung to her legs in the heat, but she did not dare loosen it. The name widow still clung to her like a second skin, and she wore it as armor, now armor against the men who once called themselves her family. She had fled them at dawn 2 days ago, leaving behind her home in Bozeman and the grave of her husband, and everything they tried to take. Her fingers ached from gripping the handle of the bag, inside of which lay her last few coins and the deed to a small cabin her husband had built before the war called him away. She had not known peace since burying him. The in-laws came quick pressing, demanding, calling her useless without a man and unfit to keep the land. They tried to take the house, the land, and worse, her dignity. But Verena had not survived the war years alone to be swallowed up by bitterness now. She had heard of a place west of Missoula, near the foothills, where a ranch once offered safe work for women in need. It was her only plan. The driver called for a brief stop, and Verena stepped down to stretch her legs at the watering trough outside a weather-worn saloon perched beside the road. That was when she saw him. He stood beside a roan horse, one hand resting on the saddle horn like he had nowhere else to be. Dust streaked his boots and his gray shirt clung to him with sweat, but he looked steady, a man who had not run from anything in a long while. His name was Prescott Ellery. He did not speak at first, just watched her, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. There was a hollowness in him, like someone who had forgotten what it meant to feel something. "You lost?" he asked finally, voice low and calm. "No," Verena said, her chin lifting. "I know where I am. I just do not know where I am going next." He nodded once, like he understood that kind of in-between. "You got people?" "Not anymore." Prescott studied her for a moment longer, then glanced at the stagecoach. "That thing won't take you anywhere worth going." "Where are you headed?" "I heard there's work out west. I am looking for a place called Cedar Hollow." His brow lifted. "That place burned down last spring, sorry to say." Verena's throat tightened. She turned away quickly, hiding the panic that rose fast in her chest. He saw it anyway. After a pause, he said, "I got a ranch about 15 miles north. It is quiet, no one bothers me. I could use help keeping the place up if you are not afraid of hard work." Verena turned back to him slowly. "Why would you offer that to a stranger?" Prescott looked away toward the far hills. "Because sometimes strangers show up when you are too tired to keep going alone." The silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. She studied him, the steadiness in his voice, the shadow behind his eyes. He looked like a man who had stopped hoping for anything better a long time ago. "All right," she said softly, "but only for a little while." Prescott gave a slow nod, then offered his hand. "Come on then, my horse can carry both of us." Verena hesitated for a heartbeat, then took his hand. His grip was strong but not rough. He helped her onto the saddle behind him, and she held the satchel tight on her lap as the horse started forward. The sun dipped low as they rode into the valley, the wind curling through the pine trees like a whisper. Prescott's ranch was a modest sprawl tucked between tall cottonwoods and a quiet stream. The house, though weathered, stood firm, and a small barn leaned against the slope nearby. The land smelled of hay, horse sweat, and pine. "Place is nothing grand," he said as they dismounted. "But it holds together." Verena stepped down and took in the space, the silence, the open sky, the rustle of grass. "It is more than I had yesterday," she said. Prescott looked at her longer this time, and something softened in his expression. Inside, the house was plain but clean. He showed her to the spare room and offered her water to wash the dust off. That night, they ate stew by lamplight, their spoons clinking quietly against the bowls. Prescott did not talk much, but he listened when she spoke about her husband, about the in-laws, about the fear that clung to her ribs like a second breath. He never interrupted, never judged, just listened. When she finished, he said, "You are safe here. No one will touch you." Verena met his eyes across the table. "Thank you." He only nodded, but it meant more than any promise she had heard before. Days passed. She cleaned the house, helped with the horses, mended fence lines. He showed her how to tie proper knots, how to spread seed without wasting it, how to spot a sick calf from a healthy one. Each night they ate in quiet comfort. Each morning they greeted the sun side by side. The weight in her chest began to ease. And slowly, she saw the weight in him lift too. He laughed once, a short, surprised thing, when a chicken tried to steal bread from her apron. She laughed too, and the sound filled the kitchen like light through a cracked door. Verena did not know when she started watching him longer. Notice the way he brushed his hand along a horse's flank like it was something fragile, or how he stood at dusk, watching the sky as if waiting for something that never came. One evening, after tending the horses together, she reached for the reins and her fingers brushed his. Prescott froze, looked down at their hands, then up at her face. Neither of them moved. He spoke first. "I do not know what you are looking for, Verena, but I do not think I can be it." She shook her head, quiet. "I am not looking for anything." She stepped closer. "But I would not mind staying a little longer." Prescott's breath caught. His hand stayed against hers, and for the first time in years he nodded. "All right," he said, voice rough. "Stay." That night she slept without fear. And in the barn, Prescott sat long after dark, holding a small wooden carving he had not touched in years. Hope, he realized, did not always come with thunder. Sometimes it arrived like a woman in a black dress, holding her life in a satchel and looking him straight in the eye. The first frost touched the grass by late September. Morning light sifted through the windows of Prescott's house, pale and low, catching on the steam rising from the kettle as Verena poured water into a tin basin. She'd let herself settle into the rhythm of things, rising early, tending to chores without needing to be asked, her hands finding work without hesitation. But the stillness inside her hadn't quite settled. Not yet. Prescott had gone out before dawn to check the north fence, where a tree had come down in the night. He left a note scratched on the back of a feed sack, pinned to the kitchen shelf with a nail. She didn't read it twice. By midday, she had the wash hung and the hearth swept, and the silence in the house began to stretch too long. She stepped into her boots and headed out toward the pasture, walking the fence line where the field dipped into willows. The wind carried the earthy scent of cattle and the sharpness of pine sap, and somewhere overhead, a hawk called once before the sky swallowed it back up. She found him near the creek bed, sleeves rolled, saw in hand, working to clear the fallen tree. He looked up when she neared, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, sawdust clinging to the backs of his hands. "You didn't have to come out here," he said, voice even. "I didn't come to help," she said. "I came to ask you something." He leaned the saw against the trunk and wiped his brow with the back of his arm. "Go on, then. You told me once this land was quiet," she said, stepping closer. "But I've been here long enough to know quiet isn't the same as peace." Prescott looked down at the tree, jaw tight. "I didn't promise peace." "I didn't ask you to," she replied. He nodded once, slow. "Then you should ask the rest." She hesitated. The wind tugged gently at the hem of her skirt, and she let it. "Did you lose someone out here?" Prescott didn't answer right away. He bent, lifted a branch from the pile, and snapped it over his knee before tossing it aside. "My brother," he said finally. "He didn't come home from the war." "I kept waiting. First winter passed, then another. After a while, I stopped looking at the road." Verena folded her arms across her chest, not to guard herself, but to hold something still inside her. "What was his name?" "Caleb. He was younger." Laughed too loud, drank too fast, never could sit still long enough to finish a meal. A faint crease formed between his brows. He wrote once, said he'd seen too much and didn't want to come back to nothing. She stepped closer until they stood near enough to share the same patch of light. "This isn't nothing. You built something out here." "Only because I couldn't face what I left behind." Verena glanced at the tree, the saw, and the creek winding behind them like a silver thread. "Or maybe you knew peace had to be made, not found." Prescott met her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and picked up the saw again. "You planning to stay through the winter?" "That depends," she said. "Does the roof leak?" "Not unless it rains sideways." She gave him a look. "It will, you know it will." He smiled small, almost unsure, and bent back to the work. "Then I guess we'll fix it when it does." That night, she sat by the fire, shelling dried peas into a bowl while Prescott mended a broken bridle strap at the table. The silence between them wasn't sharp anymore. It filled the space like a blanket, worn, familiar, something passed between hands. "I found your carving," she said without looking up. "In the barn." His stitching paused. "That's so." It didn't look finished. "It wasn't." She dropped a pea into the bowl. "You could finish it if you wanted." He didn't answer right away. "Then, I wouldn't know how." "Maybe you don't have to know. Maybe you just do the next thing until it starts to look like something." Prescott set the strap down. "You talk like someone who's already figured it out." "I haven't," she said. "But I'm not running anymore." He watched the fire flicker along the hearthstones. "Neither am I." The wind outside picked up and the shutters rattled once before stilling. Verena stood, crossed to the window, and pressed her palm to the cool glass. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'd like to ride out past the ridge. I haven't seen what's past that rise." "There's a grove of quaking aspens," Prescott said. "They'll be gold by now." "Come with me." He didn't hesitate. "All right." She turned then. He was still seated, hands resting on the table, but his face had changed. Something pulled open, quiet and careful, like a door left ajar in a house long closed. Neither of them said more. But when she passed behind his chair on the way to the kitchen, she paused. Gently, she let her hand rest on his shoulder, just a moment, just enough. Prescott didn't look up. He only turned his hand over on the table, palm open, as if waiting for something he hadn't dared ask for. The horses moved at a slow walk through the North Pass, their hooves muffled by pine needles and dry leaves. Autumn had come in full, and the aspens stretched tall overhead, their golden leaves trembling in the light breeze like coins in sunlight. Verena rode with her hands loose on the reins, her back straight, a shawl drawn over her shoulders. Prescott kept a quiet pace beside her, one hand resting near his saddle horn, his eyes scanning the trail ahead. Neither had spoken much since leaving the ranch at first light. They didn't need to. The land set enough the hush between the trees, the call of a woodpecker tapping somewhere above, the scent of damp moss rising from the shaded ground. At a clearing where the trees opened and the earth sloped gently down into a meadow, Prescott pulled his horse to a stop. Verena followed suit without needing to be told. Ahead, the ridge fell away into a small basin where a narrow stream wound through the grass like ribbon. The aspens there stood brighter still, their leaves catching the sun in bursts. "You've been here before," Verena said, her voice low. Prescott nodded once. "Used to come here with Caleb when we were boys. Back then, it felt like the edge of the world." She dismounted slowly, leading her horse toward a flat patch of grass. Prescott followed, tying both reins to a low branch. He knelt beside the creek to drink, cupping the cold water into his palm. When he rose, she was watching him, a question held behind her eyes. "Why'd you stop coming?" she asked. He looked toward the trees. "Didn't feel right alone." Verena stepped to the water's edge and knelt, gathering her skirt as she dipped her hand in the stream. "It's beautiful here. Feels like a place meant for remembering or forgetting," he said. She looked up at him. "You still trying to forget?" "No." He crouched beside her, brushing a stray pine needle from the surface of the water. "I'm trying to carry it different." They sat in the quiet for a long moment. A bird called once from the far edge of the clearing, then went silent. Verena plucked a bit of moss from the rocks and rubbed it between her fingers. "I used to think grief was something you walked through," she said. "Like a stretch of bad road, but it doesn't end, you just get used to the weight." Prescott didn't answer right away. Then he said, "You carry it well." "I'm tired of carrying it alone." She hadn't meant to say it, not like that, but the words came honest, and once they were out, she didn't take them back. Prescott turned to her slowly. "You're not alone anymore." The wind stirred between them, soft as breath. Verena dropped the bit of moss and stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. "I've never lived through a winter out here," she said. "Not in a place like this." "I've got enough wood split for most of it," Prescott replied, "and the chimneys sound." "So long as we patch the south window, we'll be all right," she glanced at him. "You already planned for me to stay." "I figured you'd decide when you were ready, but I made room." Verena crossed the clearing to where the horses waited. She laid her hand on her mare's neck, stroking gently. "You ever think about what comes after winter?" He stepped beside her. "Sometimes. And I reckon it'd be easier to think about if I knew you'd still be here." Her fingers paused against the horse's mane. "I've got nowhere else I want to be." Prescott's breath caught, not loud. Just enough that she noticed it. He turned toward her, his hand brushing hers where it rested on the reins. He looked at her as though he were still learning her face. She didn't step away. "I don't want what we've built to be temporary," he said quietly. "Not the work, not the quiet, not you." Her voice was steady when she answered. "Then don't treat it like something passing." He leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. "I won't." And she believed him. They didn't kiss. Not then. But the space between them closed, not with touch but with certainty. The kind that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. When they rode back, the sun was low, and the sky had begun to shift toward dusk. The shadows stretched longer, but the air stayed warm, and the horses moved easy beneath them. By the time they reached the ranch, the first stars had appeared. Verena unsaddled her mare and led her into the barn without needing to be asked. Prescott lit the lantern and hung it from the beam, the glow settling between them like a promise. She turned to him, brushing straw from her skirt. "I can finish up here," he nodded but didn't move. "Verena." She turned back. "I don't want to sleep in that house alone anymore." She didn't look away. "Then don't." He stepped forward, his hand finding hers, not hurried, not uncertain, just right. That night, they shared the same roof, not out of necessity, but out of something grown quietly between them, fed by shared silence, steady work, and the slow, deep knowing that some things were meant to last. And in the dark, with the wind resting against the windows and the earth holding steady beneath them, neither of them reached for what had been lost. They held on to what they had found. By late October, the days shortened and the air carried the edge of winter. Smoke curled from the chimney most mornings, and the horses' breath fogged in the cold when Verena led them out to pasture. She'd begun wearing wool skirts and fingerless gloves, her shawl traded for a heavier wrap Prescott had found tucked away in a cedar chest he hadn't opened in years. They shared the house now without ceremony. She kept her sewing in a basket near the hearth, and her boots rested beside his by the door, mud-spattered, worn but dry. In the evenings they sat close, not always touching, but near enough to feel one another's warmth. When the wind rose, Prescott would glance toward her, as if to make sure she was still there. She always was. One morning she found him on the porch mending a gear harness. His hat lay on the railing and his brow was furrowed in concentration. "You've got guests," he said without looking up. She stepped onto the porch, blinking against the pale light. A wagon stood at the edge of the yard, its canvas sides drawn back, revealing 2 women and a boy bundled in quilts. The horse hitched to it looked lean, its coat dull with travel. The older woman climbed down first, boots crunching over frost. "You Prescott Ellery," he rose, setting the harness aside. "That's right. We came as sent by Myra Langley, said you might take us in. We worked her land 2 summers before the fire." Prescott looked to Verena, then back to the woman. "How many nights you need? Just a place to settle a bit. I've got coin for feed and hands for work." "This boy's strong and the girl can sew a patch faster than most grown women." Prescott nodded once. "Barn's clean, you'll sleep warm. Come sundown, we'll talk more." The woman gave a short nod, then helped the others down. Verena watched them head toward the outbuilding, their footsteps cautious but not afraid. She turned to Prescott. "You've done this before." "Not in a while," he said, "but I remember what it's like to arrive with nothing." She stepped closer, her voice low. "You've room for more than just me in that heart of yours, don't you?" He looked at her, the corners of his eyes marked with lines deeper than age. I didn't until you showed up. Later that day, while the newcomers warmed themselves near the hearth, Verena stood at the table kneading dough for the evening's bread. Prescott sat nearby, sharpening a blade across a whetstone. "You ever think about the spring?" she asked, eyes on her hands. "Not usually," he said, "but this year's different." She glanced up. "What would you plant first?" he considered. "Barley grows quick, good for the soil. Maybe start some root vegetables in the back corner." She smiled faintly. "I've never planted a thing in my life." "You will," he said. "I've seen what you can make with rough hands and little else. A garden won't be any trouble." The blade stilled in his hand. "I've also been thinking about what to do with the south room. The one with the broken shutter. Could patch it. Make it into a nursery." She froze, the flour-dusted dough still beneath her palms. Her voice came quiet. "You sure about that?" "I'm not guessing at it," he said. "I want a life, not just a stretch of days." Verena swallowed, the warmth behind her eyes sudden and sharp. "Then let's make it one worth keeping." That night, after the bread was baked and the barn locked tight, she climbed into bed beside him without hesitation. His arm found her waist, and she settled into the curve of his body like a promise made flesh. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. But inside, there was only stillness, the kind that came after long shifting, when something finally found its place. Snow came early that November, drifting down in soft, steady layers that muffled the world and made everything seem closer. Verena stood at the window, pressing her fingers into the wool shawl around her shoulders. Outside, the pasture was pale and still, broken only by the slow movement of cattle near the fence line. She could hear the steady scrape of Prescott's boots on the porch floorboards as he hauled firewood to the stack beside the door. Inside, the house had grown warmer. Not just from the hearth, but from the presence of the 3 new souls who had folded themselves into the rhythm of the place. Esther, the eldest, had taken over the preparation of preserves and root cellar inventory without being asked. Her daughter, Mee, spent most of her hours near the fire, sewing repairs into garments with a quiet skill that required no praise. Her boy, Nathan, had taken to following Prescott around the barn, always watching, always listening. Verena stepped away from the window and crossed to the hearth where a pot of stew simmered low. She stirred it slowly, breathing in the scent of onion and bay leaf. The house had grown full. But it didn't feel crowded. It felt whole when the door creaked open and Prescott stepped inside, brushing snow from his sleeves. She turned to meet him. He set the bundle of kindling down, then straightened and met her eyes. "Fence on the west side held," he said. "Esther's boy helped me run the line back around the pines. Thought I'd be correcting his work the whole way, but he's got a good eye." She set the spoon aside and wiped her hands on the edge of her apron. "He's watching you more than you think." "I noticed," he said. "Reminds me of someone." Caleb. Prescott shook his head. "Me, when I still believed I could become something." She stepped closer. "You're more than something. You're the man who made this place safe." He looked at her, and whatever weight still clung to him settled a little deeper into the past. "You did that too, maybe more than me." Before she could answer, Mee's voice chimed from the other room. "Miss Verena, Mama wants to know if we can use the last of the beeswax for candles." "I'll check," Verena called back. Prescott reached for her hand before she turned away. "Walk with me tomorrow, down to the lower meadow. I want to show you something." She nodded. "I'll come." The next morning broke clear, the sun throwing long light across the snow. They left the house after breakfast, bundled in coats and scarves, their boots crunching through the crusted top layer of snow. The trail to the lower meadow dipped past the edge of the cottonwoods, and Verena leaned into Prescott's steady pace, her breath forming soft clouds in the cold. When they reached the edge of the field, she paused. The land opened wide here, ringed by hills and trees, the snow lying smooth and untouched. Prescott pointed to the far slope. "That's where I was thinking." "For what?" He turned to her. "A second cabin, smaller, just enough room for 2 beds and a stove. Esther and the kids could have it come spring. They've done more than enough to earn it." Her eyes found his. "You've already made this their home." "It's not just mine to give anymore," he said. "It's ours. I want you to have say in everything that comes next." Verena stepped closer. "Then let me say this. I want to grow old here. With you. I want a garden and a child's hand wrapped around mine. I want to rise each day knowing I've built something worth waking for." Color touched the tops of Prescott's cheeks, though she couldn't tell if it was the cold or something deeper. "I've never had a thing I was afraid to lose," he said. "Until you," she reached up, took his face in her palms. "You won't lose me." He leaned forward and their foreheads touched, the warmth of him grounding her. His hands found her waist, steady and sure, and she closed her eyes. When their lips met, it was slow and quiet, like the first light of morning, gentle, certain, and full of promise. They stayed there a while, the world around them hushed by snow and sky. When they finally turned back toward the house, their steps were matched, their shadows long and joined. Winter passed, and spring came slow but certain. The creek thawed, the aspens leafed out, and the garden plot behind the house filled with shoots barley, carrots, and rows of early peas. Esther and her children moved into the new cabin by mid-May, and Nathan took to fencing like he'd been born to it. One warm afternoon, Verena stood at the porch railing, her belly round beneath her dress. Prescott joined her, wiping his hands on a rag after fixing the yoke. "You all right?" he asked. She turned to him with a smile that rose from somewhere deep and quiet. "The baby kicked when I was stitching this morning, twice." Prescott rested a hand against her side, reverent. "Boy or girl, won't matter," she said. "They'll be safe. They'll be loved." He leaned and kissed the side of her head. "So will you." The sun began to dip low, casting gold across the fields. From the barn, Nathan's laughter rang out as he raced me to the fence post. Esther watched from her porch, a basket of mending in her lap, her shoulders loose for the first time in months. Verena turned to Prescott, her hand finding his. "This is what peace feels like," he nodded. "And it's ours. Every bit of it." They stood together as the light faded, the land around them quiet and alive. And when the stars came out one by one, they stayed side by side, a pair drawn from hardship, shaped by grace and bound by something stronger than words. They had built a home not just of wood and stone, but of trust, of healing, and of love that asked for nothing but the truth, and in that home they lived, together, always.